Here we go. Um, so the title of today's talk is Down the Road Apiece, Moving Maine's Buildings. And for those of you who aren't from around here, down the road apiece is a quintessentially Maine expression. It's delightfully vague. It could mean half a mile or it could mean 20 miles. It's the kind of direction that makes perfect sense to Mainers and baffles everyone else. And it feels like the perfect way to describe what we're talking about today. Buildings that have literally traveled down the road, sometimes just a piece, sometimes much further. Today, I want to share with you a practice that's deeply embedded in Maine's history, but often overlooked. And I mean, actually picking up entire structures, houses, churches, libraries, taverns, and relocating them, sometimes across town, across the water, sometimes miles down muddy roads, physically moving buildings. My first story is about Evie Kimball Barber, documenting her own house being moved. You can't see her in these photos, but she's there, standing behind her box camera, watching teams of oxen haul her cottage through Sedgwick. It's 1920, and she's a widow running a photographic postcard business. Owning a building on Main Street in Sargentville could certainly have provided a location to capture customers. With typical Yankee resolve and frugality, she moves her cottage from Doherty's to a plot next to the library, says the back of these photos. What I love is this. She didn't just move it, she photographed it. Multiple angles, different moments, the oxen straining, the crowd gathered, the White House in the background that would later burn. Evie was petite but formidable. A professional photographer who roamed the Blue Hill Peninsula in her Model A, selling real photo postcards to anyone who would stalk them. Warm or curt, depending on whether she liked you. She kept piles of prints and negatives in her house, according to neighbors. So here, in this moment, in these photographs, she's a woman in transition, not just the building, but her whole life. And she's doing what she always did, watching, documenting, and making sure we'd remember. This is how buildings moved in Maine, with oxen, muscle, and with someone like Evie, making sure we'd never forget. The practice of moving buildings isn't just a quirky historical footnote. It reveals something fundamental about how Mainers have always approached their built environment as something adaptable, movable, and worth saving. And understanding why and how buildings were moved helps us see the relationship between transportation, infrastructure, and community development in a whole new light. Today, we are going to explore this practice through three lenses: the technology that made it possible, the community effort it required, and the values that motivated people to move buildings rather than tear them down. These aren't separate stories. They're deeply intertwined, but looking at each one helps us understand the full picture of what it meant to move a building and what it still means today. And I have to say, even putting together this presentation has been a community effort. I put a call out to all the cultural institutions around the state, asking them for examples of buildings that had been moved. And I was overwhelmed with the sheer mass of examples that came my way. And so organizations sent me pictures and stories that spanned centuries, houses floated, churches moving down Main Street, libraries moved by a truck. It really reinforced to me that this practice is woven throughout, Maine's history. It's been a practice that communities still remember and value, and still happens today. So what you'll see here is really a community, the state community coming together to tell this story. So I really want to just send out a huge thank you to everyone who contributed. You'll see their examples throughout this presentation. So let's start with the question that probably everybody asks when they first hear about this. How That is what we're first going to look at. Before we dive into the how, we need to understand the why here and not there. Because here's something interesting. Building moving was and still is a common practice in America, especially along the Atlantic coast, but it was virtually unheard of in Britain, where many original builders originated from. So why is that? Well, the answer comes down to what many buildings were made of and how they were built. In Britain, centuries of deforestation meant that by the time American colonization was underway, timber was scarce and quite expensive. Buildings like the one on the left of the slide here were predominantly constructed of heavy masonry, thick stone or brick walls that were essentially immovable. The weight alone made relocation not impossible, but certainly impractical. Not to mention the fact that mortar and stone construction doesn't take kindly to being jostled around. But here in America, and particularly in Maine, timber was abundant. The forests seemed endless. Buildings were constructed using wood frame techniques, mortise and tenon, balloon framing, platform framing, and even rarely plank framing, like the 1786 Dummer House in Hallowell, which was successfully moved in 2018 to make room for a parking lot on its original site. And you can see that one here on the right in its new position. These methods created structures that were relatively lightweight and crucially somewhat flexible. So a well-built timber frame building could withstand a surprising amount of movement without falling apart. The walls weren't load-bearing masonry. They were often just cladding attaching to the frame. And this meant that American buildings were almost accidentally designed to be movable. They were assets that could be relocated rather than demolished. So in a young, expanding nation where people were constantly on the move, following economic opportunities, this turned out to be incredibly practical. So how did they actually move the buildings? Let's start with the earliest methods before modern machinery existed. The basic principle was surprisingly simple. Lift the building, put something under it that can roll or slide, and pull. Of course, the devil is in the details. First, they had to separate the building from its foundation. Workers would dig around the foundation and use large timbers as levers to gradually lift the structure. Once it was high enough, they'd slide heavy wood beams underneath. Then came the really backbreaking work, and the building would be placed on wooden rollers, which were essentially logs laid perpendicularly to the direction of travel. And as the building moved forward, pulled by teams of oxen or horses, the rollers at the back would be picked up and carried to the front. It was slow, methodical work. A good day might see a building move a few hundred feet. This slide shows just how labor intensive and what a spectacle the moves were. I love that the people lining the street, and just to the right, you can see someone running to catch the event. And then on the left, my favorite part, the lead pair of oxen are just visibly straining with the load. It's really sort of majestic, I think. A good example of a move using this technology is the Hall House, relocated in August of 1924. And I will say that bits and pieces of all of this technology continued to be used. So if it was a smaller building or the mover didn't have the newest, greatest, latest technology, they would go to these old tried and true methods. And this is one of those. So in 1924, Fred Hall and his family moved their substantial 3-story, 12-room house down Pine Point Beach in Scarborough with everything still inside. Walter Tingley, who was an experienced house mover, led the operation using just 6 houses and quite a large skilled crew. Workers continually laid greased wooden skids along movable tracks ahead of the house. As Tingley's horses pulled the structure forward, the crew retrieved the skids from behind and repositioned them, creating an endless path across the beach. Progress was a steady 600, 700 feet a day. They covered 1.5 miles over several days. Thankfully, the beach route made this possible, so they didn't disrupt the roads or traffic. The Portland Sunday Telegram documented the move, noting that this method spared Mrs. Hall, quote, the onerous duty of settling, unquote, into a new home. Winter actually offered some advantages for moving buildings. Oftentimes in Maine, things slow down in the winter, but not so with house moving. Once the ground froze solid, builders could use large sledges instead of rollers. And winter moves did require careful timing, though. Too early and the ground wasn't solid, too late and the spring thaw would turn everything into mud. Moving a house during mud season was not a thing you wanted to mess with. However, when the earth and waterways were frozen, they provided a smooth, stable surface, and the sled could glide easily, more easily than rollers could turn on uneven ground. So I've shown a couple of examples of winter moves here. On the left, the boarding house being moved on the frozen Kennebec took 44 houses, only a day and a half. So that's the same time period as the Hall House move, but over ice, they traveled 8 to 9 miles. Of course, there were a lot more houses in this move, but you can still see that that was a significant difference. The building on the right deepens the transportation connection that we're talking about. Charles Gooding purchased the 1760s Old Ledge Schoolhouse in Yarmouth and relocated it during winter to a site near the newly installed Portland Electric trolley line. And he used it as a ticket booth for visitors who were accessing his observation tower perched on the ledge above. The mid-1800s brought technological innovations that really transformed building moving from an art into something closer to a science. The game changer was the screw jack. Screw jacks allowed movers to lift buildings with much greater precision and control. Instead of using levers and sort of hoping for the best, workers could place multiple jacks at strategic points and raise the building slowly while keeping it level the whole time. This made the whole operation safer and more predictable. Along with screw jacks came improvements in the systems that supported and moved buildings. So steel I-beams replaced wooden timbers in a lot of cases, offering greater strength with less weight. Greased and wooden beams were still used, and they could slide against each other more smoothly than older systems. And eventually, steel rails, almost like miniature railroad tracks, provided an even more controlled way to move buildings. And the example I've chosen to highlight this method is the Spurs Corner Schoolhouse. In the 1940s, this schoolhouse in Otisfield made a remarkable journey along Route 121 in Otisfield. The small wooden structure, which you can see on the left, rolled eastward for about 2 or 3 miles towards East Otisfield as part of the town's effort to bring scattered rural students together under one roof. Using screw jacks to lift the building and steel beams to distribute the weight, you can see in the center pictures that movers were able to transport the schoolhouse on a surprisingly narrow truck bed. And I think a tractor might have even been involved at some point. This technology represented a turning point in structural location since the steel beams allowed the load to span across fewer support points, which made the navigation of narrow country roads far more practical than the earlier methods required. This schoolhouse would become part of a larger consolidated building, which you can see on the right, serving elementary students from across the community. And then decades later, after a new school opened in the early 1990s, the traveling schoolhouse found its final purpose as the Otisfield Town Office, where it continues to serve the community today. If you think the old methods were impressive, modern building moving is genuinely astounding. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I will say that today's structural movers use hydraulic jacks that can lift with incredible precision, unified hydraulic systems, which is sort of one step up from the screw jack using hydraulic power that keep everything perfectly level, and even specialized dollies with dozens of wheels that can distribute weight and navigate obstacles. And as you can see here, lots of cranes are also used in modern moving. Modern moves can happen really quickly What might have taken weeks in the 1800s can sometimes be accomplished in a day. Movers can navigate around utility lines, over bridges, through intersections, and they can even lift buildings high enough to slide entirely new foundations underneath them. What amazes me about comparing the historical and modern moves is that while the technology has become increasingly sophisticated, the fundamental principle remains exactly the same. Lift it, support it, move it carefully. It's just that the carefully has gotten a whole lot more precise. And here you can see the Pigeon Hill Schoolhouse in Oxford, which was moved to make the Oxford Historical Society and K Museum, which was a relatively recent move, although of a small building. There's one more moving method that we do need to talk about, and it's particularly relevant to Maine, moving buildings by water. Maine's extensive coastline and network of rivers meant that water was often the easiest highway available. Moving a building by water required different techniques, but offered some real advantages. Buildings could be floated on barges, rafts, or even on their own foundations in some cases if they were made of a buoyant material. Water transport eliminated the problems of rough roads and steep hills. Tides could even provide some motivating power. And for island communities or coastal towns, water was often the only practical option. Like many islands, Monhegan has limited resources, and Ruby Brackett solved this problem by literally importing a whole house, which you can see here on the right, and she moved it from Boothbay to the island in 1919, and it's still there on the harbor side of Fish Beach, and I suspect has been included in a lot of paintings by artists there. Probably one of the most well-known relocated houses in the state was moved via water, and I would be remiss if I didn't include this in my talk. Built in 1806 in Phippsburg by a sea captain named Thomas McCobb, this federal mansion earned the name Spite House from a family conflict. While McCobb was away at sea, relatives manipulated his father's estate and took control of the family's original home. So when he came back, McCobb responded by building this far more impressive residence nearby as sort of architectural payback. By 1925, it faced demolition. The new owner arranged to relocate it roughly 85 miles north to Rockport, which was quite a distance, so water transport did make sense in this case. The moving company installed extensive timber bracing throughout the interior, designed to keep the structure rigid so that the plasterwork and even the brick chimneys, which were oftentimes taken down and then just completely rebuilt, would survive the voyage. And you can see in the first two photos here, they've shored up those chimneys so they won't fall down. Workers positioned the building onto a railroad barge, creating a stable platform for sea travel, and even the foundation granite of multiple tons of stone blocks was loaded aboard. A tugboat and a lighter towed the barge up the Maine coast, where draft horses then moved the house from the barge to a prepared foundation. This move didn't strictly preserve the old building. This was in 1925, keep in mind, so preservation was a little different then. The new owner added substantial wings, but he did do it using materials salvaged from another period building from Harpswell. This significantly expanded and altered the original structure, but in 1974, it was added to the National Register, and the listing recognized the whole full narrative of it. The spite that created it, the engineering that saved it, and even the transformation that followed. So not just building, but the entire story. The technology of moving buildings evolved over more than 2 centuries, from simple rollers and oxens to computer-controlled hydraulics. But what hasn't changed is the ingenuity required and the fundamental belief that a building is worth saving. So that brings us to our next question. Who did this work? Moving a building has never been a solitary endeavor. Even today, with all of our modern equipment, it requires a coordinated team. But historically, moving a building was a community event, and in many cases, it still is. So understanding that social dimension helps us see these moves as more than just engineered projects. And I suspect that's why many of you are here actually to learn about this community aspect of it. To understand the community aspects of a building moving, it helps to think about barn raisings. That tradition of neighbors coming together to construct a barn in a single day, it wasn't just about efficiency, it was about mutual aid and social bonds. It was the same practical reciprocity that made rural communities function. You help me today, I'll help you tomorrow. Building moves operated on similar principles. When someone needed to move a house or a barn, neighbors would turn out to help. It wasn't charity, it was an investment in social capital. Everyone understood that someday they might need the same help. But these weren't grim, silent work parties. By all accounts, building moves were and still are exciting events, part work bee, part carnival. People would gather to watch, children would run around underfoot, and there was usually food involved, a lot of food. The communal meal was a crucial part of the event. Families would distribute dishes, and everyone would eat together once the day's work was done. This wasn't about feeding hungry workers, though that was important. It was about celebrating the achievement and reinforcing community bonds and acknowledging everyone's contribution. There's almost something festive in the descriptions we have of historical building moves. Yes, it was serious work, dangerous work, certainly, but it also was a break from routine and a chance to see something remarkable and to be part of something bigger than yourself. The right side showed a photo here shows a particularly large crowd as the Benjamin Greenhouse in Brunswick was moved from downtown to the Bowdoin College campus in 1905. And I love this story. The journey was interrupted when the railroad company, who thought that the house would ruin its tracks, parked two steam engines in its path and wouldn't let the house proceed. And that's the moment you see here. And it obviously you can see that there are so many community members out there interested in this. Eventually, the move was allowed to continue to its final destination at 259 Main Street, where it became part of the Bowdoin campus. In May 2017, Canton, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, faced a crisis and an opportunity. The Historical Society's home, a deteriorating former church, was beyond saving. Meanwhile, the neighboring Grange and Masonic building was slated for demolition to make way for a convenience store expansion. But the deadline was only months away. What happened next really showcases Maine community spirit at its best. C.N. Brown Company donated the threatened building plus $5,000 towards relocation costs. Historical Society membership exploded from 7 to 42 people practically overnight. Volunteers swarmed in with trucks and trailers, carefully packing collections, while others prepared the site. Items within that needed to be deconstructed before move were done so. In those frantic weeks, residents worked side by side, salvaging what they could from the old church while preparing and to welcome the new structure. Today, thanks to grants and local fundraisers, the relocated building serves as both a museum and a gathering space. As building moving became more common and the technology more sophisticated, something interesting happened. Specialists emerged. By the mid to late 1800s, professional house movers were advertising their services in newspapers. These were people who had developed particular expertise in the mechanics of moving buildings, who owned the necessary equipment and could be hired to manage the operation. And this professionalization changed the nature of building moves. What had originally been a community endeavor did become more of a commercial transaction. The professional mover would bring his crew and equipment, and the community's role shifted from providing labor to providing support, but still watching the spectacle. But as you can see with this relatively modern move, they still retain their character as community events. People still like to watch. They still like to help when they can. And it was still something that happened in public and that neighbors talk about and becomes part of the local memory. Hence why people gave me so many examples of moves throughout the state. I think it's worth acknowledging also just how dramatic the events are. Imagine seeing a house, your neighbor's house maybe, or an old schoolhouse rolling down the street or floating across the harbor on a barge. It's not something you see every day, even in an era when building moving was common. There's something fundamentally captivating about seeing something massive and supposedly immovable in motion. It challenges our basic assumptions about how the world works. And in an era before television, before the internet, this was live entertainment. Even today, people line the route. They make excursions to watch. In some cases, newspapers report on upcoming moves, and then the crowds come out. Building itself is almost like a parade float, making a slow, stately progress towards its new home. When I think about the community dimensions of building moving, what strikes me is how it reflects a fundamentally different relationship with the built environment than we do often have today. These aren't just structures, they're communal assets worth collective effort to preserve. The willingness to turn out and help move a neighbor's house speaks of a level of community interdependence that's harder to find in a more individualistic society today. And the fact that people treated these moves as events worth witnessing suggests a level of engagement with the physical fabric of their communities that we should probably do more often. But ultimately, the community aspects of moving buildings weren't separate from the practical and technological challenges. They were what made those challenges surmountable. You couldn't move a building alone. You need a lot of hands, shared knowledge, collective will, and that, as much as any technology, is what makes buildings possible, moving buildings possible. We've talked about how buildings were moved and who moved them. Now we need to ask why. What motivated people to go through all this effort? And the answer to that question has changed over time. Tracing the evolution tells us a lot about how Americans and Mainers in particular have valued their built environment. In the earliest period of American settlement and expansion, people moved buildings for fundamentally practical reasons. If your livelihood was tied to a particular location, a harbor, a mill site, a crossroads, and that location changed, you might need to move your building rather than abandon it or build anew. Remember that timber was abundant, labor was expensive at this early point. If you'd already invested in the work of constructing a building, it made economic sense to relocate it rather than start from scratch. Buildings represented significant capital investment, and in a cash-poor economy, moving that investment made more sense than just sort of writing it off and starting over. So we have examples in the state of buildings that were moved from Massachusetts to Maine in the 17th and 18th centuries even. But even today, moving buildings can be an economically sound option. Many historic buildings are available for free or at a nominal charge with the provision that they're moved from the site. Cheap Old Houses is a website and Instagram account that is occasionally lists an old building that the sale price is $1 or free, but you have to move the building. Nonprofits can particularly benefit from these types of situations. In 2004, the 1812 Leighton homestead, which you can see here, was donated to the Falmouth Historical Society. Rather than purchasing a brand new building or purchasing another building or constructing a new structure, the society was able to put funds directly into moving the building, connecting it to utilities, and repairing it. So that in 2018, without ever having to purchase a building, it was opened as the Falmouth Heritage Museum. Another motivation is, of course, flood zones and natural habitat climate change issues. Maine's dramatic coastline and powerful rivers have always posed a risk to structures. Coastal erosion, storm surge, river flooding, they're not new, though we do see a lot more of them today. Historical records show buildings being moved back from eroding shorelines, relocating to higher grounds after floods, or simply just shifted away from areas that were vulnerable. What's striking is that people chose to move these buildings, again, rather than simply rebuilding elsewhere. The structure itself had value. The materials, yes, but also the work that had gone into it, and often a sentimental attachment as well. This motivation is particularly resonant today as we face the rising sea levels and increased storm intensity due to climate change, and especially in Portland, where we are a harbor and port town. The historical practice of moving buildings in response to environmental threats offers a model for adaptation that we're increasingly having to consider again. The historic Giles Barn at Autumn View Preserve in Boothbay stands as a remarkable testament to both preservation and adaptability. Dendrochronology dating revealed that part of this married frame timber structure originated actually in the 1700s, making it an exceptional example of early American vernacular architecture. Believed to have been built by the Lishman family, the barn served the land's agricultural heritage for over centuries, housing livestock, storing hay, and actually even supporting dairy operations into the 1980s. When the previous owners prepared to donate the land to the Boothbay Region Land Trust in the 2020s, they faced a critical challenge. After more than 250 years, the barn's original site was succumbing to a rising water table, and the land was becoming increasingly saturated and unstable, so the barn was almost sinking. Rather than accepting the loss, they chose an extraordinary solution. Preservation timber framing meticulously deconstructed the barn, carefully marking each timber before transporting them to their workshop. Over a winter, craftsmen restored original materials wherever possible, replacing only what could no longer bear structural weight. And the barn was then reconstructed at the highest point on the property. Now safe from water damage and serving the land trust's equipment storage needs, the Giles Barn stands as a physical reminder that preservation requires both reverence for the past and thoughtful actions for the future. I particularly love that this example is on a conservation land trust, so it's the land and the barn that are being stewarded here. Now, as towns grew and urban areas developed, real estate dynamics created new motivations for moving buildings. When streets needed to be widened or land value shifted, buildings that were in the way might be moved rather than demolished, although certainly many were demolished. And this is where we start to see the intersection with transportation infrastructure that connects to the broader theme of our programs this spring. New roads, broader streets, streetcar lines, eventually highways, all of these transportation improvements required space. And sometimes, as we can see here in a photo of the intersection of Franklin and 4 streets before the Franklin Arterial Project, that space was occupied. Property owners faced a choice: lose the building entirely or invest in moving it. If the buildings had significant value rather than economic or sentimental, moving became attractive. I will say that that's not the case in the area in the photograph that you see here. Many of the buildings were considered slums, and so they were just cleared wholesale for that project. But we are now, in modern times, considering whether or not moves like that are the correct path to follow. In the late 1950s, Edward Grant faced losing his home in Grantville, which is a close-knit Yarmouth neighborhood where 3 generations of Grants had lived and worked as fishermen. When the state claimed their waterfront land through eminent domain, and then this was for the interstate highway construction across Yarmouth Harbor, the tight community was basically torn apart. While most of the Grant family members relocated without their homes, Edward chose a different path. Around 1959 to 1960, he had his entire house physically moved to 33 East Main Street rather than abandon the structure that held his family memories. There's a lovely newspaper article where he is talking about that. Despite the personal cost, though, he accepted the sacrifice, telling the Portland Press Herald in 1958 that the move may be inconvenient for his family, but the new highway would benefit many people for years to come. We also shouldn't underestimate the emotional motivations for moving buildings. These weren't just structures, they were homes, they were places where families had been born and raised, where memories accumulated. If a family needed to relocate to better farmland or to follow employment or to join other family members, taking the house with them kind of preserved the continuity of the family. Ancestral homes in particular had quite a bit of significance. The house your grandfather built, the place where generations had gathered. This wasn't something to abandon lightly. And in some cases, moving a building was a way to maintain that connection to place, even though the building was physically relocated. This move tells a remarkable story of a family devotion in Dennysville. When ALR, that's Aaron Larrabee, forget what the R stands for, at Gardner, passed away in 1891, his sons, Fred and Edwin, faced a decision about their widowed mother's home. I just love this story. Rather than leaving her isolated, they orchestrated something extraordinary. They used teams of oxen to relocate the entire house, including actually multiple outbuildings across the fields to Water Street. And this new location placed their mother Abigail and then their unmarried sister Eva right beside the son's own residences and the family's thriving general store. It wasn't just about convenience, of course, it was about keeping the three generations of gardeners together. The store itself was a community cornerstone. It sold everything from farm equipment to Austrian china and even had a summer soda fountain, which I imagine was quite popular. So I think this move perfectly illustrates how house relocations in Maine serve deeply personal purposes and actually preserve family bonds while adapting to changing circumstances. Somewhere along the timeline we've been tracing here, there was a fundamental shift, and buildings began to be valued not just for practical utility or personal meaning, but for historical and architectural significance. And this is probably what we're most familiar with today as people who are interested in historic buildings. Preservation movement was born, and with it, new motivations for moving buildings. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there was a growing awareness of American architectural heritage. This is when a lot of organizations formed to identify and protect significant structures, among them Greater Portland landmarks. And buildings were recognized as documents of history, like physical evidence of how people lived and built. And so this created kind of a new category of value, historical significance. So a building might not be moved because it was useful to the owner, but because it was important to the community's understanding of its own past. Along with historical value came appreciation for architectural merit. So distinctive styles, craftsmanship, innovative construction techniques. These were the reasons to preserve buildings. The work of particular builders or architects became more important, and the architectural consciousness meant that buildings might be moved specifically for preservation purposes, relocated to museum sites, historic districts, or even to locations where they could just be better protected and maintained. On this slide, you can see the main state building on the left in its original position in the 1892 Columbian exhibition in Chicago. It was only supposed to be a temporary structure, but Mainers held a lot of pride about the architecturally stunning structure, which was designed by Lewiston native Charles Sumner Frost, who at that time was quite successful in Chicago. So as a result of this pride, the building was deconstructed because it was masonry, shipped to Maine, and reconstructed as part of the Poland Spring Resort. It still stands there today, and it is still quite an amazing structure. Another example, built in 1855 and then transformed in 1885 with elaborate Victorian details, is the Gingerbread House in Norway, which is probably its most beloved yet controversial architectural landmark because of its move. It's fairly controversial. Its ornate woodwork, decorative brackets, and striking turret turret showcased the exceptional craftsmanship of the era, making it an irreplaceable treasure in Maine's architectural history. By the early 2000s, years of neglect had taken their toll on the building. You can see in the middle there. When the owner offered it to the community on the condition that it be moved, concerned citizens rallied to save it. They formed the Gingerbread House Task Force, which was later changed into the Norway Landmarks Preservation Society, and got to work. In 2011, the house made a 900-foot journey to its new home at 500 Main Street, where you can see it on the right. The architectural firm of Barbet and Wheelock developed a preservation plan, which then guided the careful restoration of the exterior. Volunteers and skilled craftspeople brought the house back to life. You can see they restored the turret, the chimneys, the original wood siding, and all the intricate details. Windows were meticulously rehabilitated by Bagala Windows, and the house received its signature four-color paint scheme. Support came from community donors, foundations, and local businesses. Today, even though the house was sold, and that's where the controversy comes into it, is that the community came together for all of this, and there was some bad feelings about the building being sold and no longer being owned by a nonprofit. But the nonprofit never existed to do anything other than stabilize and save the building. So once it got to that point, selling it into private ownership made sense. But today, a preservation easement does protect the building forever. In the mid-20th century, that brought a particularly complex moment in American urban history, and you'll see this in the exhibit too if you visit. Urban renewal projects, often driven by highway construction and slum clearance programs, threatened entire neighborhoods. Thousands of buildings were demolished in the name of progress. But this wholesale destruction also sparked some resistance. Preservationists fought to save buildings, and in some cases, moving structures did become a way to rescue them from demolition. Buildings became both victims and survivors of urban renewal. Displaced, yep, but also saved. This period saw the beginnings of gentrification as middle-class residents moved into working-class urban neighborhoods. Historic buildings were sometimes moved away to make room for new development, or conversely, moved into areas being redeveloped to create sort of instant historic character. Here's a house move motivated by urban renewal that we're intimately familiar with here at Greater Portland Landmarks, and Kate alluded to at the introduction. In the early 1970s, Spring Street was transformed into a high-speed arterial, which required demolishing dozens of historical buildings in its past. And among those slated for destruction was the 1845 John Brown House, a striking Gothic revival gem designed by architect Henry Rowe. You can see it in its original position on the left. The building features ornate carved woodwork and quite a dramatic gable and an eye-catching second-floor oriel window. When Greater Portland Landmarks learned of the demolition plans, we sprang into action. The house and property belonged to the Holiday Inn, who were planning and did build a large hotel on the plot, and they donated the house to Landmarks. We then orchestrated an ambitious rescue in 1971. Because the city streets were too narrow for the move at the time, the entire structure was lifted from its foundation at 87 Spring Street, transported on a sort of circuitous route down Commercial Street, back up Danforth Street, and finally to its new position in the West End at 387 Spring Street. The house found a champion in Marta Morse, who has been an incredible steward of the property since purchasing it in the 1880s. Her forward-thinking commitment to preservation has continued to help save one of Portland's finest examples of Gothic revival architecture. And today, the Gothic house stands as a testament to what communities can achieve when they fight for their architectural heritage. Increasingly, buildings have been recognized as anchors of community identity. The old schoolhouse, the historic church, the original town hall, these structures carry meaning beyond their physical form. They're touchstones of collective memory, symbols of continuity. I didn't include a photo of it here, but please do look up the Playhouse in Eastport. It's currently owned by the Tides Institute, and it's a tiny but fully formed 1900 child playhouse that was donated to the Tides Institute and is now being moved to form the center of a public park, which is a really great example of this. Moving such buildings rather than losing them preserves that identity, even as communities change. It's a way of saying this matters to us and this is a part of who we are. Now, adaptive reuse is another motivation. Late 20th and early 21st centuries have brought like growing appreciation for adaptive reuse. We love that. We love taking old buildings and giving them new purposes. It connects both the practical and environmental values. Historic house can become offices or apartments. Church can become a community center. A mill becomes loft housing. We've seen lots of those in this presentation already. Sometimes moving a building is part of that adaptive reuse. Relocating it to a site where its new function makes more sense. This Dennysville structure exemplifies remarkable architectural adaptability. You wouldn't even know that these were the same buildings. It began life as the Dennysville Lumber Company's manufacturing facility, and it was relocated following the 1920s lumber mill closures. And then it was later transformed into poultry use, and then the community repurposed it as a youth center in the 1960s, hosting scouts, civics groups, social gatherings, and then today it's privately owned, and you can see it on the right here, and it functions as an artist workspace and a gallery, really demonstrating how historic industrial buildings can serve evolving community needs across generations. And this also speaks to one of the more important contemporary motivations, which is environmental sustainability. We understand that buildings contain an enormous amount of embodied energy, the energy that went into extracting, processing, and assembling all these materials. Demolishing a building wastes all that embodied energy. Moving it and reusing it conserves it. So the same environmental ethic recognizes that even when buildings can't be moved whole, preservation should extend to careful deconstruction and salvage of materials and architectural elements. This environmental argument for preservation and adaptive use has become increasingly powerful as we grapple with what we talked about before with climate change and resource depletion. The greenest building, as they say, is the one that's already built. When I look at examples of building across Maine's history from the 1700s to the 2000s, all across the state involving every type of structure from houses to churches to civic buildings, I see this evolution of values playing out. Early moves were practical. Mid-period moves increasingly reflected growing awareness of historical value, and contemporary moves often explicitly invoke preservation, sustainability, and community identity. But the continuity is really remarkable, I think. We look at buildings, we see something of value worth saving and worth considerable effort of relocating. That consistent valuing of the built environment tells us something important about Maine's relationship with place and history. So what does this all add up to? What can we learn from the practice of moving buildings? First, a building moving reveals how transportation infrastructure shapes the fabric of the cities and towns that we live in. When streets needed widening for automobile traffic, when highways cut through urban neighborhoods, when railroads require right-of-ways, when harbors need expansions, buildings have to respond. The choice between demolition and relocation was, in many ways, a choice about what kind of change communities wanted. Demolition meant a clean break, fresh start. Moving buildings meant negotiating between old and new, finding ways to adapt existing structures to new condition. And this slide starkly shows the impact of the Spring Street arterial project that prompted the Gothic house move. The left-hand photo clearly shows a cluster residential buildings on the right, which included the Gothic house. The center photo shows the massive disruption that infrastructure construction requires. And then the finished project, seen at the right, shows a landscape dominated by transportation needs. Buildings like the Gothic house, which were moved in response to transportation changes, are physical evidence of the negotiation between old and new. They show us that infrastructure development doesn't have to mean wholesale destruction of what came before. They demonstrate adaptation, compromise, and creativity, really, in the face of change. And this remains relevant today as we think about climate change, new transportation technologies, shifting population patterns that reshape our communities, really. The historical practice of moving buildings does offer a valuable model for managing change. But building moving does sit on a spectrum of preservation approaches. At one end is complete preservation in place, keeping the buildings exactly where and as they are. And this is obviously optimal. Moving buildings represents sort of a middle ground, which preserves the structure, but not the location. And then at the other end of the spectrum is the deconstruction and architectural salvage, preserving materials, elements, and craftsmanship, even when the building can't stay as a whole. And all of these strategies share a fundamental respect for embodied energy, historical value, and craftsmanship. They all sort of resist that automatic reflexive impulse to just demolish and rebuild, which is quite common in America. And they also recognize that what already exists has worth. The preservation ethic that motivates moving a building extends naturally to careful deconstruction when moving isn't possible. Both practices really honor the work that went into creating the original structure and seek to preserve as much of that value as possible, which is why Greater Portland Landmarks advocates for that before demolition. And I'll leave you with one final project that shows that the practice of moving buildings hasn't disappeared and it's alive and well. Modern structural movers continue to relocate buildings for all the reasons we've talked about today. Practical necessity, environmental sustainability, historical preservation, community identity. The sophistication of the technology and consciousness about why we do it has changed. But the movement of buildings today does tend to be more about preservation. So this example is the church house at the Rufus Porter Museum in Bridgeton. And this building has been moved twice. First in 1985, which you can see on the left, when it was saved from demolition. It was slated to be a fire department practice burn. And then local historians actually discovered there were important School of Porter murals hidden beneath wallpaper. So they purchased the building from the town. Rather than just extracting the murals, they decided to move the entire structure to preserve both the artwork and the building intact. In 2017, it moved again, adding to the museum campus, adding a whole building really to the museum campus on Main Street. The move, motivated by preservation, became a town affair. People lined the streets and brought their kids to watch as the building slowly rolled down Main Street. Perfect example of everything that we've talked about. So there's something poetic about buildings that have traveled. They carry their history with them, not just the history of when and how they were built, but the history of their journey, the reasons they were valued enough to move, and the communities that chose to save them. They're reminders that place isn't fixed. Heritage isn't just about keeping things exactly the way they were. Sometimes preservation means adaptation. Sometimes saving things means letting them travel. Ultimately, the buildings we choose to save, whether by preserving them in place, moving them, or salvaging their elements, reflects our values. They tell future generations what we consider important, what we thought was worth the effort, and what we want to carry forward. The long history of building moving in Maine suggests a culture that values resourcefulness, that sees buildings as assets worth preserving. And that's pretty familiar to most of us, I think. And as we face challenges in the 21st century, the lessons of building moving really remain relevant. They don't have to be permanent fixtures. with ingenuity and effort, they can adapt to new circumstances. And perhaps most importantly, the impulse to save rather than to destroy. Um, that's an ethic we need more than ever. So next time you're driving around Maine and someone gives you directions down the road a piece, think about all the buildings that have literally traveled down those roads and think about the technology that made it possible, communities that made it happen, and the values that made it worthwhile. Thanks for your time today. I'm happy to take questions, and I hope you'll continue the conversation with me, with each other, and about historic buildings in your own community.
Thank you so much, Aimee. I just find this so fascinating and all the wonderful examples that you were able to find. I love that it came from other communities and people that this had meant something to. We did get a couple questions in the chat. And one that was interesting is by someone who actually had to duck out, was if these are all clearly examples of success stories, and if in your research you found any that went wrong, maybe that there was damage to a building um, or something sort of happened unintentionally, or maybe is that something less well documented?
I suspect it's a combination of both. I didn't come across any, but that being said, if you dig into the history of every single one of these moves, not a single one of them, everything goes right. It really is about problem solving um, just as much as it is about planning. And I think that there were probably more likely to be issues earlier on than there are in more modern moves where you have the rise of the specialist mover. There were some great photos that I came across of people dragging a small building on the back of their truck on a couple of, stripped trees, essentially. And I'm betting that didn't go very well, but I don't really have any evidence of that.
We've had a couple also just comments and adding more information. Edith Waxman noted that she worked on an 1837 house in Michigan um, that was moved down a river through a drawbridge to a new location and is now a historic home museum.
That's wonderful. I love it. People remember these in communities, don't they? It's a very memorable event.
Yeah. And I also realized I was remiss and very focused on introducing Aimee. I did not introduce myself. I'm Kate Lemus McHale, and I'm Greater Portland Landmarks Director. I spent a long time working in New York City. And an example that was very well known there was the Alexander Hamilton home, which was located within a historic district, but it was moved out of its site into a park where it could have a much better kind of aspect and visitor experience and not be as encroached upon as it was. And it was an interesting case. Aimee and I were talking about this, where when the building is moved to a new location, it's in a new orientation. And so things like bay windows that were designed to receive more sun might no longer face um, south or west. And the same was true with the Hamilton house in terms of sort of actually which is the main front entrance sort of changed in that as well.
Yeah, two examples in my talk that specifically had to grapple with that is the Gothic house, of course, which was very carefully designed by an architect to take advantage of specific aspects, and the Dummer house in Hallowell, which basically went from one side of the street to another, and they completely flipped it. But the back is much more exposed than it has ever been in the past. So, yeah, definitely something that people have to consider when they move buildings.
And Scott Hinson also added that that was its second move. It was also moved once farther back on its original site to make way for a building in front of it. Just want to make sure I got everybody's questions. Oh, we've got a few more here. Oh, Nancy Barbet has a story of one that went wrong. Thank you. A friend in Annapolis had his and his brother's house moved by water. They tied off the barge too tightly for the 1 to 2 foot tides, and the house slipped sideways into the creek.
Oh, so it does happen.
Yeah. Um, and a question, what about the 1800s building next to the Portland Art Museum that is slated for demolition? Unfortunately, that
It's
was
gone.
demolished.
Yes.
And
And we did heavily advocate for at the very least some salvage from that building. And unfortunately that didn't happen, but that is a great example of where there were many different options that could have better aligned with preservation standards. But unfortunately that didn't happen, so that building is gone.
yeah, we did advocate, I think most of you probably know, to retain that building and tried to find a way also that it may have been moved. Because there is obviously a parking lot right next to it that could have been a new site for it. And another local example that I thought of while you were talking, Aimee, is I think it's Building 12 of the Portland
Yep.
Company. Yeah, that
Hmm.
was moved. Um, all right. And then someone else commented post and beam structures make dismantling and reconstruction easier than moving intact.
Definitely. And if you want more examples of that and how true that is, go to Preservation Timber Framing's website. They specialize that. They were the ones that did the Giles Barn, and they do it all the time, and they're extremely good at it. I did a whole bunch of research on the Giles Barn and attended an event when it was sort of unveiled. And my favorite part was just this beautiful join where you had an entirely historic beam, a post that was holding it up with just this little bit of modern material because that bit of historic material wasn't structurally sound. So instead of putting a completely new beam in, they just replaced what they had to. And it was such a beautiful detail. But that was entirely possible because it was a timber frame building. It's like a big puzzle.
Oh, we've got one more question. Okay. Correction on Building 12. That wasn't the one that was moved. It was taken down and rebuilt
Yes.
in its historic appearance, but in a new location.
Yeah, and I will say that there were a few buildings in this presentation where that was the case, most often with masonry or brick buildings. But I did consider that a form of moving in this presentation. I just didn't go into it as a separate type of moving.
Yeah, yeah. And it's not as pure, of course. It's not keeping that exact historic building intact.
Yeah.
Um, okay. Well, let me just, oh, we've got one on more here. I think we've gone over our time and we have had I think I've asked all the questions. So again, thank you all so much for being here. We're really delighted. I think at the peak we had 70 people in the Zoom, and it's just wonderful to see that kind of interest and engagement in this kind of thing. And we will keep it coming and hope you'll follow along and join us again. Thank you.
And I also just want to say real quickly, if you go to the exhibit, it is an evolving exhibit. If you see something that strikes you or you want to add something to it, please contact us here at GPL. We want to add stories and perspectives to the exhibit. So go check that out.
Thank you all.
Thank you.